I always like to start this way. Hi, I'm Carl, and I'm a small church pastor. You've been in meetings other than church meetings, I can tell. I like to start that way because so often that's like a negative term that we hear, and I'm just determined to reclaim the term small church pastor and the value of small church. I've been a small church pastor for over 30 years now, but I didn't know I was a small church pastor until about 10 years ago. I thought I was a big church pastor that just hadn't arrived yet. You know, any minute, it's going to happen. Explosive growth is right around the corner. And you know, when you spend 20 years waiting for a train and it doesn't show up, you begin to wonder if you're at the right station. Starting about 10 years ago and culminating about 5 years ago, I went through a very difficult time trying to figure out what was going on and why things weren't working the way I expected they should work and the way I was told they would work if we just followed the rules and did the right things. So, but to say I'm a small church pastor, since you don't know who I am, let me just give you a bit of a background so you're aware of who it is chatting with you today. Over 30 years over 35 years in ministry, over 30 years in lead pastoral ministry in 3 different churches, all of them small. The first one was in Felton, California, a tiny little chapel in the Redwoods on the coast of California. It was so deep into the Redwoods that at noon on a sunny California day, if you pulled up into the parking lot, your automatic headlights would go on. There were parts of the building that never saw sun. It was just that deep into the redwoods. So it was a tiny little chapel in a tiny little town up in the hills, actually. And the reason people would live up on those hills is because they were growing things in their backyard that they didn't want the law to know about. As of about a year ago, it doesn't matter anymore, but back then it made a big difference. So we were there for about 4 years. That church had been through. I keep stating this statistic, and I keep thinking it's got to be wrong, but no, it was right because I went through the records of it when I was there. 37 pastors in 50 years. They were close to our denominational Bible school, and so at the beginning it was a lot of students coming through, but there hadn't been one stay longer than I think 2 years total, and so the average was barely a year each. 37 pastors in 50 years. There are some churches that haven't been through 37 pastors in 500 years. They went through 37 and 50. We stayed for 4 and just busted every record way over the top. And had a wonderful time there. And then we went to another small church in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it was it was kind of suburban, but also really, really more small town than suburban. And we were there for 20 very, very difficult months. And then left there kind of wounded and bruised and bleeding and came to the church we've been at now. We just celebrated our 25th anniversary in December. And it is in Fountain Valley, California. It's 8 miles south of Disneyland, so right in the middle of all of that population. And my first associate pastorate was in a small town up in the mountains where certain times of the year you just didn't do anything because every male was gone hunting. So you name the small church environment, I've pastored in it at some point or another. But especially 25 years ago when we went to Orange County, I thought, okay, now stuff's going to happen. I mean, I kind of get why it didn't happen in the previous place because it was unhealthy, and the place before that, there weren't enough people, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm in Orange County now. Right? Shortly after we get there, Rick Warren writes The Purpose-Driven Church, and in it he describes the reason he picked Saddleback's location is because he did a demographic study of the best place in America to build a big church in the coming decades, and Orange County is it. So that's where we went, and I think that Californians don't go to church much more often than they do here, but when we go big. So like within a half-hour drive of our front door is the original Calvary Chapel. How many Calvary Chapel folks here, right? The Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa is less than 2 miles from my house, okay? The original Vineyard is not much farther than that. Crystal Cathedral, Saddleback Church, Angelus Temple, where Foursquare started. I heard somebody hears Foursquare. Did I hear it? Yeah. Foursquare started just over the border in LA County from where I am. Fuller Church Growth Institute, where all of this whole idea of church growth came from, I just saw today, is moving from Pasadena to Pomona, still in our backyard. It's all right there. So if you've got a Pentecostal background, Azusa Street, for goodness sake, is right there. So it's not just a place where big churches start, but where big movements start. And we moved there and I think, well, okay, me too. And so we get there, and our church facility is about the size of this room. It's got a much lower ceiling, so it feels smaller, but it's about the size of this room, but sideways. So when we rearrange the chairs this way, so if you come and sit in the back row, there's only 4 rows in front of you, but it's this wide, but this deep. And a stage that's only 9 inches taller than the one I'm standing on right now. So this feels very familiar and very at home today. And we got there, and on a big Sunday, there were 30 people. They had been through 5 pastors in 10 years, and they had really seriously debated having a vote to just close the church. They were that discouraged. So we got there, and when we came with our 3 kids, we brought the only 3 kids the church had. And it was a gray, not graying, it was a gray congregation, both in mood and in hair color. And we got there, and we just spent the first few years just allowing them to help heal us and them allowing us to help heal them. After 5 pastors in 10 years, they were bruised and bleeding, and after our difficult 20 months, we were bruised and bleeding. And about 7 years later, the church was finally healthy for the first time. For the first 7 years, we didn't do any outreach. We didn't do any ministry to the community because we were too toxic to invite anybody in. It was just too sick, too unhealthy an environment. I didn't want people to come in and have to go through this mess with us. So I figured we got to fix ourselves first. It felt like a spiritual ICU where, okay, I've got a broken leg. You don't tell somebody to run on a broken leg, get the leg healed first and then do some running. And in about 7 years, we were healthy. Numerically, we were running at about 75 people at that point. And then we started doing outreach into the community, evangelism. We started being healthful now that we were healthy. And at about year 15 or 16, we were running close to 150, which in our room meant we were pretty much getting close to filling it twice on a Sunday. And we were well past our parking. We have more parking than you because from what I can tell, you have 0 spaces. We have slightly more than 0 spaces, but not much. So our parking was overwhelmed, and people were walking from the public school around the corner, that kind of a thing. And we actually were close to 200 at one point. Well, actually, when we got about 150, 160, so that was 15 years. And that was when all the church growth conferences called me and said, hey, Carl, we want you to come and teach us how you took a church from 30 to 150 in just 15 years. So if you're here for quick answers, you're in the wrong room. I do everything on a slow burn. But I never give up, and that now I've been not giving up long enough where it's beginning to pay off finally. So we got to that point, and then shortly after that, we came really close to about 200, and I thought, okay, we've got to find a bigger place. So I went and found a local junior high school, and we rented their Kappa Gymnatora Librarium. You know that room that they've all got, right? And it was about 4 times the size of this room. It was quite a big room for us. And within the next 20 months, with worshiping there on a Sunday morning, we kept our building for everything else. But on Sunday morning, we tore everything down, brought it over on Sunday morning. And in the next 20 months, we grew from just under 200 to about 400 people, doubled in 20 months. And I went to our deacon board at that time and said, okay, we're going to have to do something staffing-wise because this is killing us, that kind of fast growth we got to catch up with. Church growth proponents tell us that if we're on a growth curve, whatever you have on Easter that year, you can likely expect to have on a regular basis 2 years from then. And we had 650 that Easter. So I went to them and said, we're going to be at 600 in 2 years. And the growth curve said, yes, we will be. That's the direction we're heading. So we hired staff for about 600. And about 4 months later, all of a sudden, everything turned. And it took us 2 years to go from 200 to 400. And in less than a year, we dropped from 400 down. Actually, I don't even know how small we got because it's fun to count when you're growing. But I got to the point where I said, don't give me the numbers anymore. I know everybody's name. And we fit really easily now back in our tiny little building. We solved the problem of not enough space. So we were back in our little building, and I was miserable. In fact, I was ticked off. I was mad at the church. I was mad at this building. I was mad at myself. I was mad at God. I got mad at Rick Warren for some reason. I have no idea why. I was just angry. And I knew it wasn't good, and I knew I couldn't continue to lead a church the way I was. And so I left for 40 days. And I didn't know if I'd go back. And the only reason I left for 40 days was because I couldn't find an 80 in the Bible. It's sad but true. I actually looked through the Bible thinking there's got to be somebody in the Bible who took like an 80 or 100-day retreat. It's all 40s, just all 40s. But I thought, if it's in the Bible, they'll give it to me. And so I said, I'm going away for 40 days, and 40 days made it sound spiritual instead of desperate. And I didn't know if I'd go back. And during that 40 days, I found a local Christian counselor who had been a pastor himself, and sat down with him and just met with him weekly and just started talking. After about 2 sessions of me just emotionally regurgitating on him, I looked at him and said, so what do I do? What's the solution? Do you have any ideas? And he said, Carl, it's preliminary, but it sounds to me like you got to figure out how to redefine success. And I wanted to punch him in the nose. So I thought, so you're telling me I've been trying to jump 10 feet. I can only jump 8 feet. So I'm going to lower the bar to 8 feet, jump over 8 feet and call that success? That's cheating. I can't do that. He said, that's not what I'm talking about. He says, if the numbers are over here, if the bar is over here, success is over here. You have to figure out how to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it, because the numbers are killing you. And he might as well have been speaking another language. I had no idea what that meant. And I told him so. I said, what does that mean? What does success in ministry look like if you're not attaching numbers to it? He says, I don't know either, but we'll figure it out together. And so we went on this journey to figure out how to redefine success in ministry. And so I started doing this research, and, well, actually, as we're going along, probably ought to turn it on. There we go. Everything we're going to talk about today, I've already put up on my website at that URL. So if you want to snap a picture of it, or you'll see it on the bottom right of every slide. So if partway through you go, oh, that's finally something I want to pay attention to, then it'll still be on there and you can look it up later anytime you want. I like putting it up there because it'll always be there. You can lose paper notes, but that will always be there. There's no reason for me to ever take it down. So 5 years from now, if you go, well, what was that stupid guy who said that stupid thing that I really hated at the time but might have something of credibility now, then you can look it up. And by the way, you can look it up just to disagree with it if you'd like, but I encourage you to look it up because while I don't mind if you disagree with me, I just appreciate it if you disagreed with what I actually said. That's all I ask. Don't you hate it when you say something and then they're arguing, well, pastor said so-and-so, and you're going, I've never said or believed that in my life. They're arguing about something that I've never said. But if you're disagreeing with what I actually said, we at least have a starting point. But you can look it up there. It'll always be there. So anyway, so I had this thing, and I'm trying to figure out how to redefine success. Long story short, I end up putting all of these thoughts down in writing, and I write a book called The Grasshopper Myth. Because my wife said, stop whining and write it. And so I did, and I didn't even call a publisher. It's still self-published. But when you write a book called The Grasshopper Myth, you've got some explaining to do. So what is the grasshopper myth? And the grasshopper myth is this. It's the false impression that our small church ministry is less than what God says it is because we compare ourselves with others. Now, what's the toxic word in that sentence? Yeah. Comparison will kill you. Eleanor Roosevelt is credited with saying, no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. That's a great saying. And what happened to me was I ended up in this bad place because I gave consent to people who were not trying to make me feel inferior. Rick Warren didn't write Purpose Driven Church to make me feel bad. I read it through the wrong eyes. I've reread it since then, and I was blaming Rick for stuff that he never said. I was disagreeing with things he never said, but the thing I hate people to do to me, I did to him. Okay, now I don't agree with everything he's done. No, I don't agree with everything I've done. There's always going to be some disagreement, but I was comparing myself to all these giants around me. And of course, the grasshopper myth phrase comes from the book of Numbers, which is about the giants. The spies go into the land and 10 of them come back with this report. All the people we saw there are of great size. One translation says there are giants in the land. And then they say, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes and we looked the same to them. And you've preached on this, so you know the answer. Where did they see the grasshopper first? In their own eyes. If you don't see a grasshopper in the mirror, no one else will see a grasshopper in you. But I saw my small church ministry as inferior, And so it became inferior. It became what I projected it out to be. I saw a grasshopper in the mirror, and it became that to others as well. So I started this relentless search that I'm sure I'm going to be on for the rest of my life, and now I get to write about it and talk about it to others, about what does it mean to have a redefinition of success, particularly in a small church context. And I want to walk you through some of the things I've discovered today. One of the first things I discovered was this: small is not a problem, a virtue, or an excuse. And let me walk you through those three really important words. First of all, small is not a problem. But it's been presented that way sometimes. Sometimes we think they're saying it's a problem when they're not, but sometimes they're outright saying it's a problem. Several years ago, I wrote a blog post, read a blog post. And the blog post was entitled, 8 Reasons Some Churches Don't Grow. And here are the 8 reasons that were given. The vision is not clear. The focus is on trying to please everyone. Passionless leadership. Manufacturing energy. Lack of prayer. Unwillingness to take risks. And disobedience to scriptures and selfish attitudes. I read that list and went, man, I got to be committing at least one of those sins because my church isn't growing. But I didn't think I was being disobedient to scriptures. I didn't think my attitude was selfish. I don't feel like we're trying to manufacture energy. I thought I was praying enough. I didn't think I was passionless. But I got to be committing one of those sins because that's what everybody says is the problem if a church is small. Let me encourage you today, if you read a list like that and you don't recognize yourself or your church, just read something else. Just don't worry about it. Now, if you recognize any of those, fix that problem. But those aren't signs of a small church. Those are signs of an unhealthy church. And big unhealthy churches can have those issues too. It's got nothing to do with size. It's got nothing to do with numerical growth. It's got to do with health or ill health. And I look at that and I read it and I thought, man, he thinks that's a description of 90% of his peers in ministry because 90% of churches are small. I reject that offhand. Small is not a problem. But on the other side, we've also got to acknowledge that small is not a virtue. Small churches are not better than big churches. What's so weird is every one of those things from that big church pastor to small churches, I've heard every single one of those lobbed from small church pastors to big churches. Oh, those big churches, they're just trying to please everybody. They're manufacturing energy. There's no prayer in a big church. They're disobedient to scriptures. Oh, big churches are so selfish. I've heard, animal behaviorists have said that if you put monkeys in cages and they get angry at each other, they throw their poop at each other. And when we do this, we make the monkeys look good. It's ridiculous. Big isn't worse than small. Small isn't better than big. Big and small each have value. Small is not a more virtuous thing. I've had it up to here with the small church pastor who says, well, you know, the only reason we're small is because we're the only church in town preaching the true gospel. All the other ones are just, teachers with itching ears saying what their followers want to hear, right? If you've seen the meme, right, of the big church, this is what happens when you preach what they want to hear, and then this empty church with 3 people in it, this is what happens when you preach the truth. Stop it. What a bunch of nonsense. When we do that, we completely deny the ability of the gospel to draw people. It's ridiculous. Small is not better than big. It's not a virtue. If you really think you're the only church in town preaching the true gospel, unless you are literally the only church in your town, then let's have a conversation about your pride issue before you get up in the pulpit on Sunday, because that's a bigger issue than the size of your church. Stupid. Come on. Small is not a virtue. But finally, small is not an excuse. We can't look at it and go, when we get bigger, then we'll do good things. When we get enough money, then we'll reach out into the community. When we get, no. Small is not an excuse to do poor ministry. I could tell that from the second I drove by the building, and certainly when I walked in, I went, they are not offering any excuses for small size here. They're going to do things with excellence here. They're doing things with excellence. You can tell by just standing here. Size is not going to limit the excellence of this church. Small is not an excuse. I've read the New Testament. Aren't you glad to know that? And when I read the New Testament, what I see is there's not a single command to the church in the New Testament that cannot be done by 2 or 3 people who love Jesus, love each other, and get together on a regular basis. It doesn't require a bigger crowd. It doesn't require more money. It doesn't require a bigger building. It doesn't require a building. It requires a minimum of 2 or 3 people who love Jesus and love each other and go out on mission together. Every command in the New Testament can be met. You don't need bigger. It's not an excuse. We got to stop excuses. We got to do great ministry, whatever our size. Now, back to my story a little bit. I got through into this 40 days. And when I was in that 40 days, I was just in a bad and dangerous and difficult place. I actually went to a couple friends and said, would you take my prayer burden for me? Because I'm too angry at God to talk to him right now. And they did. And I will forever be grateful to them for doing that. But while that was happening, I didn't go home and spend my time in prayer or spend my time in Bible reading. I went home and watched stupid TV and read stupid books. Now, that is not a prescription for health. That is a confession of sin. Just so don't sit there and go, oh, Carl says when I'm in a bad way, go home and watch bad TV. No, it's not. That's a confession, not a recommendation. And so while I was doing that, if you're going to watch stupid TV, there's nothing stupider than reality TV. So watched a bunch of that. And the 2 favorite kind of shows that I liked watching during that season were the restaurant makeover shows. It's always some British guy telling Americans how to make their restaurants better. I don't know why. We hear criticism better with a British accent for some reason. I don't. And as I was watching them, I started noticing some patterns emerging. And, they'd come in and they'd say, I drove by 3 times because I couldn't see your sign. Or I walked in and nobody greeted me. Or I walked in and, wow, the smell just about knocked me over. Or they'd pick up a menu and they'd say, I've just counted 172 menu items. We're going to give you a single page with 5 items that you can do well. Right? There were these common themes that always came along. But the one thing they never, ever, ever did, they never walked into a failing restaurant, looked around and went, you know what this restaurant's problem is? It's not big enough. Never once. In fact, there were a couple times where they said, you've got too much space. We're going to block off half of it, and you're going to concentrate on this for now, and we're going to concentrate on what you can actually do given your current resources. They sometimes made it smaller to make it better, but they never said it's not big enough. Why? Because they figured out something the church needs to understand. Bigger fixes nothing. So if you're sitting in a smaller church and you're thinking, well, when we get bigger, then we'll have less problems. If you think that your problems are going to get fewer when you have more people, have you met people? Come on, man. You really think more people are going to bring you fewer problems? I mean, what fantasy world are we living in? Come on, that's craziness. Bigger fixes nothing. If you've got an unhealthy small church and you make it bigger, you will have an unhealthy big church. And that's not a better thing, that's a worse thing. But if you've got an unhealthy small church and you make it healthy, even if it doesn't get big, at least you've now got a healthy small church, and that's a better thing. If you seek health, you can't lose. Now, will health bring greater numbers? Sometimes, yeah. But most of the time, in my experience, it won't. We've all heard the stories, and I'm grateful for them. 3 to 3,000 in 3 years. Awesome, great. I celebrate that. I really do, if that's legitimately conversion growth. But for most of us, it's the slow, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly slog through to just make it a little bit better this year than it was last year. That's the reality for most of us. And I think we need to understand that that's okay. As long as it's getting better, that's okay. Because bigger doesn't fix anything. Bigger is just bigger. If bigger is the result of health, wonderful. But if we're shooting for bigger, sometimes when we're shooting for bigger, we do unhealthy things to get there. Not always. I'm not saying churches that grow bigger are doing bad things. That's not true. But sometimes, that's what happened with us when we grew to 400. The reason it collapsed is because I got to 400 in some unhealthy ways. I was pushing for numbers without putting the leadership structure underneath it. I was stepping outside of my gifting. Right? When we grew from 200 to 400, our church was the least healthy that maybe it's ever been. And because I was the least healthy spiritually that I've ever been. I was miserable and I didn't know it. So here I was a small church pastor and I didn't know it. I was miserable and I didn't know it. This guy's got no self-awareness at all. How can you be miserable in ministry and not know it? Well, because the church was getting bigger. How can a pastor be miserable when the church is doubling in 20 months? Right? But I was miserable. Why? Because I was spending all my time doing things that I'm not called to do. When you go over that 200 barrier, you do have to make a shift in the way you pastor. You can no longer be there for everybody anymore. You can't know everybody's name. And so I made the shift. I moved from being a pastoring shepherd to being a managing leader. I made it willingly, and we did it fairly well because for 20 months the thing doubled. So it was working. But I was spending all of my time raising funds, trying to find a new facility, hiring staff, fighting with City Hall, and all of those things suck my soul dry. They're not bad things. I'm grateful for people who are called to do that. But I'm not called to do that. I am not called to manage systems. I'm called to pastor people. And when I spend all my time managing systems, I was miserable, not because managing systems is wrong, but because it was outside my gifting and my calling. So I'm profoundly grateful for pastors who are called to manage systems and to build structures, because if every pastor pastored like me, we'd all be worshiping in mud huts. Nothing would ever get built, because that's not me. So I'm grateful for those who are the builders, who are the structure putter-togethers, and who design systems and are great at that. But I don't think most pastors are that. I've met very, very few. I've met a few, but not many. Very few pastors who say, I was called because I want to build buildings and because I want to put structures together and because I love hiring staff and working with them. Most pastors, when you ask them, what was your original calling? It was to pastor people, to reach out to the community. It's the relational stuff of small church. That is where our heart is. Most of us. Again, not all, and it shouldn't be all, but that's where most of us are. So bigger doesn't fix anything, and I was getting bigger, and it actually made things worse because I was outside of my calling. And part of what we do is something that I like to call IKEA envy. Have any of you never been in an IKEA? Oh, so we are all under the curse. Okay. We've got an IKEA near us, man, and I'm telling you, astronauts can see that sucker from space. They build these ridiculously big stores. I mean, I could use Bass Pro Shops or Mega Costco or Mega Walmart, but I really can't because IKEA is bigger than all of those. The IKEA stores are ridiculously huge. But I want you to imagine that the chairman of Starbucks gets together with his key executives and says, we got a 5-year plan for Starbucks, and the way we're going to do it is this. We spent the last year sending our spies out to all the IKEAs in the world, and they measured them all, and they discovered that the average IKEA has 250,000 square feet. And we've measured all of our Starbucks stores, and we found out that the average Starbucks store has less than 800 square feet. We need to fix this if we're going to compete with IKEA. Right, it's a nonsense thing, right? It would never happen. Why? Because IKEA and Starbucks have completely different business models because they're doing completely different things, and they each do what they set out to do extraordinarily well. You don't have to like it, but you can't argue that they're doing what they intended to do really well, right? But here's the challenge that happens for a lot of us. We go to a conference or we read a book by an IKEA pastor from an IKEA-sized church. And then we look at it, we can't figure out why the structures don't work in our Starbucks-sized church. It's because it's a different business model. It's not wrong. When Andy Stanley talks about their methods and their systems, he is not wrong. In fact, he's really good at it. But it doesn't apply. Most of it doesn't apply in my church. Because I didn't start my church with 2,500 people like he did and grow it to 35,000 like it is now. The numbers are just too vast. There's not that much of an overlap. But what we do is we have IKEA envy. And we're trying to do it the IKEA way, just drop a few zeros, and it doesn't work. The first time I ever went to IKEA, I remember it. There were arrows on the floor. I walked in, it's a big store, I got it in my head. It's a furniture store. It's just really a big furniture store. So I'm walking in expecting a furniture store. And what is this? Like, I can't even wander around. It's this maze that I have to go through in the order that they have designated, following these arrows on the floor. And by the time I'm done with it, I feel like a rat coming out of a maze, and I'm so hungry that they throw those Swedish meatballs at you just to reward you for having made it through the maze, right? They put escape hatches in there now. Here's the secret escape hatch to get from section 1 to section 7 so you can get out of here quicker. They've got escape hatches in them now. But they literally had arrows on the floor. I don't think they do anymore, but they had arrows on the floor just to help people understand how to negotiate this. And the big churches have an arrows on the floor approach to ministry, because if you have to manage the movement of thousands of people on a weekend, you better have arrows on the floor or the thing falls to pieces. If you're running multiple services in multiple venues, all of which have to hit an exact mark, because at this point in 7 different venues, that screen is going to change to the main guy preaching on the main campus, well, you can't go over by 30 seconds because you're going to come in 30 seconds late to the sermon. Everything's got to be exact. And so they're teaching from that standpoint, and it's not a bad or wrong thing to do. It simply only applies at that size. But you walk into a Starbucks, there's no arrows on the floor. Right? Sit where you want, hang out as long as you want. If you walk into a Starbucks and you see college students in the corner cramming for finals and they're there for hours and hours, Starbucks is not upset about that. They gave them plugins and Wi-Fi. That is not a sign to say, get out of here quick. They're saying, come in and rest a while. They've changed the way Americans meet. When I, talking online to somebody and I realize, hey, let's actually get together, I've never once said, hey, let's meet at the IKEA between us. Right? It's at the Starbucks. Why? We go to the Starbucks, and half the time when I buy a Starbucks coffee, I'm not buying it for the coffee. The cup is just rent for the chair. Right? And why am I telling you that? Because in a Starbucks-sized church, we got to look at it and go, we can't do it the IKEA way. There's no reason for us to do it the IKEA way. They have to do it that way because of size. We get to do it a different way because of our size. We get to hang out. We get to slow down. We get to go deeper into relationships. Even on a Sunday morning, it doesn't have to wait for small group time. So create an environment that makes sense for your size. Starbucks has created an environment that makes sense for their size. And so how do they grow? By a whole bunch more Starbucks rather than mega Starbucks. I was in the Dallas airport a while ago, walked through 1 terminal and walked past 7 Starbucks. And there are 6 terminals. That means there's probably 42 Starbucks in the Dallas airport. Well, we need to fix this problem. We need to put them all together and make a mega Starbucks. Then you'll finally have critical mass. I hate that word critical mass when we're talking about churches. There's no critical mass. 2 or 3 is good enough. There's critical mass if you want to get to an IKEA size. But if you want to do good church, there's no critical mass. You can do good church at any size. Right? We've got to make our adjustment. We've got to get away from IKEA envy. Now, when we start doing that, we've got to start thinking about small and big churches. And again, the idea of critical mass comes from, well, at a certain point, then it can't really be legitimate. It can't really have heft. It can't really, we use all these different phrases until it gets to be a certain size. And, people aren't going to come to small churches. Well, that's just simply not true. There are 2 billion Christians in the world, and half of them attend small churches. 1 billion people. So, people will come to small churches. But, yeah, there's a but they won't give up quality to do so. Now, a generation or 2 ago, quite frankly, you didn't have to have all that much quality because it may have been the only church in town, or it was just simply habit or duty. And in Europe, in many places, it was the law. Everybody, 90% of people used to go to church in Europe. Why don't we go back to those days? Because I don't want to order people under penalty of law to go to church. It doesn't work that way. We got to stop longing for the good old days. They were only old, they weren't good. But we've got this idea that people won't go to small churches. They will. but they're not going to give up quality to do so. So the front half of that sentence is encouraging. That back half may make you feel discouraged, but it doesn't need to, because here's the other part of that truth. Quality looks different in a small church than in a big church. Just like Starbucks does it differently than IKEA. See, if we're only looking at the IKEA-sized churches, we're going, okay, I just have to do arrows on the floor, only smaller. And if you're trying to do arrows on the floor only smaller, you're just going to do arrows on the floor badly. You know, especially where I live. When we first got there, we tried to do, because that was just what we always did, the Easter pageant, the Christmas pageant. Really, 7 miles from Crystal Cathedral, I'm going to put on an Easter pageant with people in bathrobes and linens off the bed, and that's going to draw people in when they can drive less than 10 minutes and be at one of the greatest Christmas and Easter spectacles on the face of the earth at Crystal Cathedral. Really? And after a couple of years of that, we realized, no, this is dumb. This doesn't make any sense. So we just do it a different way. We do it in a way that works for small, for people who want a more intimate experience on Christmas and Easter and every single Sunday. It's not less than, it's just different than. It's a Starbucks way rather than an IKEA way. We lean into what makes small valuable. So what we'll talk about for most of the rest of the time together is, what does quality look like in a small church, and how is that different from the big? Not to compete with the big, and not to say that the big is bad. It is not bad. It's simply different. Or what we'll use is, we're going to use this illustration for the rest of our time together. I love a good Venn diagram, and this is one of my favorites. In fact, it's kind of the basis for the new book. And at any time during a break or whatever, my wife has got copies of the books back there you can pick up if you want to. And just so you do know, because you don't know me, the first book, The Grasshopper Myth, has been out 5 years. This has been about 2 months. Has been out, Small Church Essentials. This one has an actual publisher. This one's still self-published. I just call my printer and go, I need more. But this one actually has Moody Press as a publisher. And so this is more the kind of the philosophical statement of the value of small churches and helping small church pastors who may be discouraged become less discouraged. And then this one puts more tools in their hands, thus the wrench on the cover. So it's a more practical approach to it, but both have some value. So and $10 a piece, or is it $15 for the two of them? Anyway, thus ends the ad. But we're going to do this for the rest of our time together. And what you'll see in there is, in the circle on the left are the big church essentials. So anytime we go to a conference or we read a book by a famous pastor, you're almost always going to be hearing from a pastor of a very, very, very large church. So they're teaching from the left circle. And you'll notice the left circle doesn't completely overlap the right circle. So if we're pastoring in the right circle in a small church, and we go and we hear from a big church pastor, we have to understand, first of all, that not everything they say is going to apply to our context, not because they're wrong or I'm wrong, but because size just makes distinctions. And here's the deal. Instead of a ladder that says 50, then 100, then 200, I hate the ladder because up higher on the ladder is better and lower on the ladder is bad. So I don't like the ladder idea of. But the Venn diagram, what it does is it fixes the idea in our heads of one being better than another. Because if your church is smaller, those circles overlap less. And if your church is bigger, those circles overlap more. That's all. So it's not better or worse. It's just more overlap, less overlap. That's all. But I went to conferences for so many years, and first of all, I didn't know that there wasn't a complete overlap. I thought, well, they're just a better church than me, so I'm going to do what they did because it's better. And why is it better? Well, because it's bigger. And so I'd take everything home and I'd try to duplicate it all, and at least 2/3 of it would fail. It got to the point where my congregation would dread every time I went to a conference. I'd come in with the latest idea that's going to fix this church, and they look at each other and go, did he read a book or did he go to a conference this time? Right? They just knew the pattern. And they weren't unwilling. They were just tired. They were exhausted. It wasn't working. And I thought it was because we were making mistakes, and it was because most of it didn't fit. So first of all, I didn't know that it wasn't a full overlap. And secondly, had I known there was an overlap, I wouldn't have known which part was in the overlap and which part wasn't. And so that's been a big part of what I've studied over the last few years. And now what we'll talk about today is what's outside the overlap. So we're not going to talk about the left circle because that's taught by everybody else. And I don't know the big church stuff. I'm not a big church pastor. And I'm not going to talk about the stuff in the middle because I'm going to assume that you know the stuff that every church is supposed to know and that every pastor is supposed to know about church. I'm going to assume that you understand that to be a church, you probably ought to believe in God, and believe in the authority of Scripture and have an understanding of salvation through Christ. I'm going to assume those things about the group just from what I know of Calvary Chapel and Foursquare. We'll go from anybody else other than Calvary Chapel or Foursquare in the room? Any pagans in the room? Where are you from? I should have waited until after that before I made that comment. Where are you from? Non-denominational. Okay. And I'm Assemblies of God, just so you know. So we are denominated in 4 ways. Okay. But obviously enough commonality that we're not going to have much problems transposing ideas back and forth between each other. But so that middle thing we're not going to talk about because we're going to assume that you know certain things. But we're going to talk about the circle on the right because it's not taught a lot. Because what I've discovered, I had to really, really, really dig for. The only reason I wrote my books is because I couldn't find my books. If somebody else had written about it ahead of me, I'd have read their stuff and gone, oh, cool, that's what I'll do. And I'd have just gone on my merry way. I only wrote it because I couldn't find it. It's just that hard. And it's weird because it's 90% of churches. And we've got almost no resources for how to do that size of church well. So that's what we're going to talk about is the circle on the right, and not the part where it overlaps. Just that part where we have small church things in common. So here's how we're going to do it in the next couple sessions. Next session, we'll take a short, just little stretch break right now, and then we'll come right back, and we'll talk about how do we discover and use what your church does well. Even if you're not doing it well now, there is something your church can do well. And in a big church, you say, okay, we're going to do this well, and they can do almost everything well because they have enough people and enough resources, or they can hire the resources and bring in the people. They can do almost everything well. In a small church, we have to discover. The word discover matters. We don't create it. We have to discover what we do well. So how do I figure out the DNA of my church and leverage it for the sake of the kingdom? That's what we're going to talk about in the next session. And then we'll have lunch, and then we'll come back after lunch, and we're going to take a look at what does it mean to equip the people in the church to move our church towards a desired future rather than being stuck in the past like a lot of small churches have a real challenge with. So that's kind of where we're going to head for after the bit of a break. And I really do encourage us to follow each other online. Again, the notes are that's the old one from my last session. That should be just Arlington instead of BLC 2018, as you see on the bottom corner of the other ones. Like my new small church Facebook page, @Carl on Twitter and so on. And my blog, I actually blog at Christianity Today, but the best way to get there is to go through the front door of newsmallchurch.com. I write about these things usually 3 times a week. So you can find that at Christianity Today. But why don't we take just a stretch? We're just after the hour, so let's come back at 10 after. So we got about 7 minutes just to stretch, grab a break, and then we'll come back and finish and go to lunch.